At my own divorce settlement, my stepsister sat beside my husband like she belonged there. Then she slid a $100 bill across the table and smirked. "Book yourself a cab home." Nobody stopped her. Nobody defended me. The room stayed silent while I sat there humiliated. Then my lawyer opened a single folder and placed it on the table. Within seconds, the smiles vanished, and everything changed. I didn't grow up knowing how to want things quietly. That came later. That came from practice, and from loss, and from a particular kind of marriage that teaches you, slowly and without ceremony, that what you want and what you're allowed to have are two different categories. Before Mercer Home, before any of the things that would eventually define the shape of my adult life, I was someone who worked. That sounds simple. It doesn't fully describe what I mean. Work was the organizing principle of my existence from the time I was old enough to understand that the world was divided into people who did things and people who watched things get done, and I had strong, early, instinctive feelings about which category I wanted to occupy. My mother was a hospital administrator, not a doctor, not a nurse, not the visible face of anything. She managed the invisible machinery, vendor contracts, staffing rosters, budget allocations that allowed the people with medical degrees to do the parts of the work that got acknowledged. She was extraordinary at it. She was also entirely invisible to the institution she kept running, because that is what happens to people who do the foundational work that everyone assumes is simply happening on its own. She never complained. That was one of the things I admired about her and one of the things that frustrated me. She was too practical for bitterness. She had decided with clear eyes that the transaction was worth it. Watching her taught me something I didn't know I was learning. There is a particular kind of person who holds things together from the inside, who never needs to be thanked to feel satisfied, who measures success by the work itself rather than by what the work earns them in the eyes of others. I became that kind of person, so completely that by my late 20s working in operations consulting, it had stopped feeling like a trait and started feeling like the simple truth of who I was. I found the leaks, I fixed the broken systems, I handed the results to the people whose names would go on the reports. I did not mind this arrangement. I am telling you this because it matters for what comes later. It matters that I was not, by nature, someone who kept records, built files, documented my contributions with the practiced caution of someone who suspected they might one day need to prove what they had done. I learned to do all of that, but it was learned, not instinctive. It was the lesson that the years with he and Mercer Home eventually burned into me with enough force that it has never left. Document everything. Not because you expect betrayal, because the work deserves a record, and records outlast trust. I was 31 when I met my ex-husband at a conference in Portland. He was representing Mercer Home. He was charming in the practiced, effortless way of people who have never had to work hard to be liked, and also, once you got underneath the charm, genuinely interesting. He read voraciously. He had opinions about architecture and manufacturing history that weren't simply inherited from his family's business. He could hold a real conversation. We were in Seattle by the following spring, engaged by the end of the year after that. I would like to say I saw something during that period that I chose to overlook. Some early signal that what we were building wasn't built on equal ground, but the honest answer is that I didn't see it. Or rather, I saw it and didn't recognize what I was seeing. I thought the way he stepped back from the operational details was confidence in my ability. I thought the way he let me run things was trust. It was not trust. It was convenience. And those two things can look identical from the inside until they don't. There are companies that announce themselves and companies that simply exist, the way certain geological features exist, not because anyone decided they should be there, but because enough pressure applied in the right direction for long enough eventually produces something permanent. Mercer Home was the second kind. My father-in-law had started it in 1963 in a rented workshop in Tacoma. He was 24 years old, recently discharged from the army, possessed of a skill he had discovered during summers in his uncle's cabinet shop. He could look at a piece of wood and understand what it wanted to be. Not mystically, precisely. He understood grain and tension and the way different species of timber respond to different treatments, how a board would behave when worked and finished and sitting in someone's living room 20 years from now getting more beautiful as it aged. He had not planned to start a company. He had planned to get a job at an established workshop. None of them were hiring, so he started his own. By the time I married, Mercer Home had been in existence for 40 years and bore almost no surface resemblance to that rented workshop in Tacoma, while remaining, at its core, exactly the same thing. A company built on the belief that well-made objects were worth making, worth paying for, and worth keeping. 41 showrooms across the country, a licensing portfolio spanning custom office builds and boutique hotel interiors, manufacturing partnerships in North Carolina and Virginia, sourcing relationships with fabric mills in Portugal and timber suppliers in Oregon and British Columbia. What they did not have was a coherent operational infrastructure connecting all of those pieces. This is not a criticism. It is the characteristic condition of a company that has grown through decades of good instincts and favorable markets without ever imposing formal systems on itself. When growth is slow and consistent enough, you can manage enormous complexity through accumulated habit and institutional memory, and the particular knowledge that long-tenured employees carry in their heads without ever writing it down. The system works until someone retires, until a vendor relationship goes sideways, until you try to scale into a new region and discover that what worked in the Pacific Northwest over 15 years doesn't transfer to the Southeast because nobody there has those 15 years, and nobody wrote the manual. By the time I became part of the company's orbit, Mercer Home had reached the point where its complexity had quietly outgrown its infrastructure. Not in in ways that showed up dramatically in the quarterly numbers. The margins were still healthy, the brand still strong. In ways that showed up in the spaces between the numbers, in supplier relationships that hadn't been renegotiated in a decade, in a distribution model built for the company's size 15 years ago and never updated to reflect how the business had grown, in small inefficiencies compounding across dozens of locations into a significant drain on profitability that nobody had calculated because it didn't appear on any single line of any single report. I saw it immediately. That is simply what I had spent 5 years training my eyes to see: the gap between what a company's operations look like on paper and what they actually are on the ground. My father-in-law understood what I was doing before he did. He was 70 when I met him, sharp-eyed, methodical, uninterested in small talk, but genuinely curious about almost everything else. He had the hands of someone who had spent decades working with them before sitting behind a desk, and he still moved through his showrooms the way a craftsman moves through a workshop, touching things, noting details others walked past without registering. We had found our footing early, over a conversation about timber sourcing that started as a light dinner exchange and ended 2 hours later with him pulling out a notepad asking me to walk him through what I was seeing in the supplier contracts. He was a builder. He recognized another builder, and he saw, in the years that followed, something I hadn't yet understood about my own situation: that the work I was doing inside his company was consequential in ways the company's existing legal and ownership structure didn't reflect or protect. He decided to fix that, quietly, without telling anyone, the way men of his generation sometimes make their most important decisions, not through announcement or consultation, but through action. I didn't know he had done it until the morning my attorney opened a red folder in a conference room on the 16th floor of a building in downtown Seattle, and the people across the table discovered that the story they had been telling themselves about who held power in this situation was not the story the documents told. The work began in the second month of my marriage. I want to be precise about that timeline because it matters. I did not drift into the company's operations gradually. I went in deliberately with a specific diagnosis and a specific plan, because that was the only way I knew how to engage with a problem. The diagnosis: Mercer Home's operational infrastructure had not kept pace with the company's growth, and the accumulated gap was costing them more money than anyone had calculated because no one had sat down and calculated it. I started with the distribution model. Mercer Home had built its original system in the early 1990s to serve 8 showrooms in the Pacific Northwest. By the time I married they had 41 showrooms across the country, including 11 on the East Coast added through 3 separate acquisitions. Those 11 showrooms were still being serviced through a logistics arrangement designed for a company less than a quarter of their current size, modified 3 times through handshake agreements, and never once subjected to a formal cost-benefit analysis. I did that analysis over 6 weeks. It required pulling records from 3 internal systems that didn't communicate with each other, reconciling data entered inconsistently by different warehouse managers, and building a model from scratch. By the end, I had a clear picture of what the East Coast distribution system actually cost per unit, per showroom, per quarter, and how that compared to what a restructured system would cost. The difference was significant, not dramatic in any quarter's numbers. Margins still healthy, brand still strong. Significant in the compounding way that operational inefficiencies are always significant. A quiet, consistent drag that nobody notices because it has always been there, and there is no counterfactual to compare it to. I presented the analysis to my father-in-law in October of that first year. He went through it page by page, asking questions that were precise and technically literate in ways that reminded me he had built this company from the ground up. We spent 4 hours at his dining room table going through the numbers. At the end, he thanked me and said he'd like me to proceed. It took 14 months. Restructuring a distribution system for a company of Mercer Home's complexity involves renegotiating carrier contracts, redesigning routing logic, retraining warehouse staff, and building enough redundancy that when something goes wrong, it can be caught before it cascades. I flew to the East Coast 4 times. I handled a Saturday emergency in February when the main Mid-Atlantic carrier declined to renew, and I had 60 days to identify and onboard a replacement, or the Richmond showroom couldn't receive product. He was supportive in the abstract. He did not attend a single logistics vendor meeting. He was not available for the Saturday I handled the Richmond situation. I handled it alone from our home office while he was at a golfing with a college friend. I tell you this not to make him the villain of this passage. I tell you it because it is the accurate description of how the work happened. And accuracy matters when you are trying to understand how a person ends up in the position I eventually ended up in. The supplier agreement came next. Mercer Home's primary fabric vendor, a mill in North Carolina supplying upholstery materials for the seating line, had been operating under a contract not substantively renegotiated since 2001. In the interim, the company's purchasing volume had increased by roughly 300%. The per-unit pricing had not improved. The relationship had simply continued on the original terms because the mill was good, the relationship was comfortable, and comfortable relationships have enormous institutional inertia. The leakage on this single agreement, 6% of quarterly fabric costs, over 11 years, compounded into a number that was genuinely uncomfortable to look at. I looked at it. I brought it to my father-in-law. We agreed on a renegotiation strategy. I handled the renegotiation. It took 4 months and required 2 trips to North Carolina and significant patience when the mill's owner suggested that after 30 years of loyal partnership, it was a bit rich to come in asking for an entirely new pricing structure. I did not tell him it was rich. I told him our updated volume projections for the next 5 years and what what a partnership priced appropriately for that volume should look like, and I let him do the math. We reached an agreement. The new terms saved Mercer Home approximately $2.5 million annually on fabric costs alone. My name appeared on none of the documents recording this outcome. The renegotiated contract was executed by Mercer Home. Internal reports credited the company's purchasing team. When an industry publication noted the improved margin position that year, it quoted he. I made my peace with invisibility years before I married he. What I did not fully understand at the time is that invisibility and protection are not the same thing. A careful person, working with a good attorney, could reconstruct exactly what had happened and who had made it happen. The work was documented the way all business work is documented, in emails, in meeting notes, in vendor correspondence, even when the person who did it is not credited by name. My attorney was a very careful person. He was also a very good attorney, but I am getting ahead of myself. My stepsister came into my life when I was 19 years old and my father remarried. Her mother was a soft-spoken woman named her mother who had met my father through mutual friends at a time when both of them were at the beginning of their second chapters. They were good for each other in the quiet, practical way that people who have already survived one significant loss can sometimes be good for each other. I liked her mother immediately. I liked the way she was careful with me in those early months, not pushing for closeness we hadn't earned yet. She was 17 when her mother married my father. She was already, at 17, fully herself in the way that some people are fully themselves very early, not because they have done much self-examination, but because they have decided at some level below consciousness on the precise version of the world they are going to inhabit and on the position they intend to occupy within it. Her version of the world was one in which she was central, in which things of value moved toward her rather than away from her, in which the people around her served largely as an appreciative audience. She was not a monster. I want to be careful about that. She was not cruel for the pleasure of cruelty. She was something more ordinary than that, and in some ways harder to name. Someone constitutively incapable of registering other people's needs as fully real when they conflicted with her own. She moved through the world frictionlessly, not because she was gifted at navigating other people's feelings, but because she had never fully accepted that other people's feelings constituted an obstacle she was obligated to navigate. We were not close. We were not hostile. We were step-siblings who maintained, through long practice, the kind of surface warmth that allows a room to function without anyone having to acknowledge what is actually happening beneath it. What was actually happening beneath it? My stepsister wanted things that belonged to me, not in a targeted way, not from particular animus, but in the general, reflexive way she wanted anything that presented itself as desirable. The pattern was established early and ran consistently. When I began consulting, she told people she was thinking about consulting. When I dated someone everyone found charming, she found reasons to be in rooms with him. Each instance was small enough to dismiss. The pattern, accumulated over years, was not dismissible. It was simply not something I could articulate without sounding paranoid, so I said nothing. I trusted the family connection the way you trust things you've never had a reason to test. When I married he, she was charming about it. She gave a toast at our rehearsal dinner that was genuinely funny and warm, and I remember thinking that I had perhaps been too vigilant, that I could finally relax. I should not have relaxed. The first time I noticed her paying particular attention to, he was at a family dinner about a year into our marriage. A look held half a second longer than necessary, a pivot in the conversation toward him that wasn't quite natural, the kind of thing you cannot point to without sounding unhinged, the kind of thing you would not even notice if you had not spent years watching the same pattern in smaller configurations. I noticed. I said nothing. I told myself I was imagining it. I was not imagining it. The full shape of what I had been looking at for years didn't resolve into clarity until a Friday afternoon in October, when I came home early from a work trip and walked through my own front door and found an ambiguity I had been managing for a decade replaced all at once with something that left no room for alternate explanation. The meeting in Sacramento wrapped a day early because the vendor's production manager had a family emergency and asked to reschedule. I said, of course. I booked an earlier flight. I texted he that I was heading home ahead of schedule, but didn't get a response, which wasn't unusual. He was bad about his phone when he was in the middle of something. I bought a sandwich at the airport. I read a contract amendment on the plane. I took an Uber from SeaTac rather than asking he to pick me up because I didn't want to interrupt his day. I unlocked my own front door with my own key. I set my bag down in the entryway. I called out his name. He was home. I am not going to describe what I found in detail. The detail exists, with a clarity that I suspect will never fully fade, but it is not the point. The point is what happened in the 3 seconds after, which is what I have spent considerably more time thinking about. In those 3 seconds, he looked up and saw me. And before any other expression crossed his face, before guilt, before calculation, before any social reflex that might have produced an apology, or even just the decency of looking ashamed, what I saw was irritation, not shock, not remorse, irritation. The particular irritation of someone who has been interrupted in the middle of something important and finds the interruption presumptuous. I have thought about that expression many times in the years since. It told me something no subsequent conversation, no lawyer's argument, no settlement document ever needed to tell me. It told me exactly what the balance of power in my marriage had always actually been, as opposed to what I had believed it to be. She was slower to look up. When she did, she was composed in a way that told me she had been prepared for this possibility. She stood unhurriedly. She adjusted her blouse with both hands, the same small gesture of self-possession she had been making since she was 17 years old, and wanted you to know that nothing you could do would rattle her. Then she looked at me directly and said, in a voice completely devoid of guilt, "You were always going to end up here? Some people build things things. Some people are meant to have them. That's just how it works. She picked up her bag. She walked past me to the front door. She let herself out. I stood in my living room for what felt like a long time. He said my name once, in a tone suggesting he was preparing to say something explanatory or perhaps strategic. I didn't wait to find out which. I went to the bedroom, took the bag I had just set down in the entryway, added 3 days of clothing and my laptop and my copies of the documents I kept in the locked drawer of my home office desk, and walked back out past him. I drove to a hotel on the waterfront, sat in the parking garage for 40 minutes. I know it was 40 minutes because at some point I looked at my phone and noticed the time, and registered that 40 minutes had passed, and thought, 40 minutes. That's how long it takes. That seems about right. Then I called my attorney. He answered on the second ring. I told him I needed to speak with him at his earliest availability. He asked if I was all right. I said I was not hurt. He said he could see me the following morning. I went inside the hotel and checked in and ordered room service because I hadn't eaten since the Sacramento airport, and I sat at the desk by the window and looked out at the lights on the water, and ate most of the food and did not cry, which surprised me. What I felt instead was a kind of extreme, clarifying coldness. The feeling of a person who has been living inside an assumption and has had the assumption removed all at once, and who is now beginning, without quite deciding to do it, to recalibrate. I took out a legal pad. I started writing down what I knew. Not about the affair, about the company, about what I had done there and what it was worth and what, if anything, I had done to protect my position in relation to it. I wrote for 2 hours. By the time I stopped, I had 3 pages of notes that amounted to a preliminary inventory of what I was going to need to discuss with my attorney in the morning. Some people, in the first hours after discovering a betrayal, call friends, call family, call anyone who will listen and absorb the shock. I wrote an inventory. I am aware that this says something about me. I think what it says is that I was, at the end of everything, exactly the person I had always been. Someone for whom the work was the organizing principle. Someone who turned, even in extremity, toward the concrete and the documentable, and the things that could be examined and addressed. It is not a glamorous response to heartbreak. It is, I think, the one that served me. My attorney operated out of a modest office on the 14th floor of a building in Seattle's Denny Triangle. He had practiced family law for 27 years. He was not flashy. He was not the kind of attorney who got quoted in newspapers or cultivated a visible public profile. He was the kind of attorney that very good attorneys quietly recommend to people they actually care about. A colleague named a colleague had given me his name 4 years before the divorce, over coffee at a conference in San Francisco. She had told me that any woman doing substantive financial work inside a family-controlled business needed her own independent legal counsel, entirely separate from any counsel the business used, and that she needed to have that relationship established before she ever needed it, because by the time you needed it, it was too late to build it from scratch. I called my attorney the following week. I told him the outline of my situation, who I had married, what the company was, what I was doing inside it, and he listened without interrupting, and then asked 3 precise questions, and said it would be wise to formalize my role through a consulting agreement executed as a separate legal instrument before I went any further. I had signed it almost as a formality, something that felt slightly absurd, drawing up a formal agreement with a company my husband's family ran, specifying scope and deliverables and compensation terms, as if I were an outside contractor rather than a woman who had brought her skills to bear on problems she saw in front of her. He had suggested a compensation structure below market rate, reflecting the informal nature of the arrangement, but legally binding and documented in a way that would hold up to scrutiny. I signed it and filed it and more or less forgot about it. My attorney kept building the file, calmly and systematically, against the possibility it would eventually become necessary. When I sat across from him the morning after the Friday in October and slid 3 pages of legal pad notes across his desk, he read them, asked several questions, then looked up and said that he thought we were in a stronger position than I might have expected, and that he wanted to share something with me that he had been meaning to discuss for some time. He told me about the trust. He had learned of it through a disclosure in the company's financial records that he had reviewed the previous year, a disclosure that his legal team had presumably filed without fully understanding its implications, or without expecting that anyone outside the Mercer family's counsel would ever examine it carefully enough to understand what it said. My father-in-law had restructured the company's ownership 3 years earlier in a way that fundamentally altered who held controlling authority over Mercer Home. The trust, now controlling 56% of all voting shares, the trust without whose trustees' approval no major corporate action could proceed, named me as its sole trustee. My father-in-law had not told me. He had not told anyone. He had simply restructured the ownership of his life's work and placed its controlling authority in the hands of the person he had watched spend 4 years understanding and fixing and rebuilding the things he had spent 40 years constructing. I sat with that information for a moment. Then I asked my attorney what it meant for the divorce. He smiled, small, precise, controlled, the only kind my attorney ever allowed himself, and said that it meant the settlement offer his team was preparing to bring to the table was going to require significant revision. We spent the next 6 weeks preparing for that conversation. 6 weeks is not a long time to prepare for the end of a marriage and the restructuring of a significant financial and legal position. It is. If you are my attorney and you have been quietly building a file for 4 years, enough. While my ex-husband and my stepsister moved through Seattle with the ease of people who believe the story is already written, we were building something in the background, not out of anger. I want to be precise about that. The anger had been present in the hotel parking garage, present in the early morning hours at the desk by the window, and had then subsided into something cooler and more useful. What replaced replaced it was not bitterness and not grief, though both of those were present in their own compartments. What replaced it was the same thing that had always replaced strong feeling when I was engaged with a problem that needed solving: focus. My attorney's approach was methodical in the way that good legal preparation is always methodical, not dramatic, not adversarial at the preliminary stages, simply thorough. We reviewed the consulting agreement and its attached documentation. We reviewed the financial records that documented the outcomes of the distribution restructuring and the supplier renegotiation, and we built a clean accounting of what those outcomes were worth. We reviewed the trust documents and their implications for the settlement calculation. We had the trust reviewed by a second attorney, a specialist in corporate governance, who confirmed my attorney's read of its structure and its implications. We also reviewed the settlement offer that his attorney, a man named his attorney, had prepared and transmitted through proper channels during the third week of our preparation. It was technically defensible. It was also, given the actual structure of the assets involved, not even close to accurate. His attorney was a competent attorney who had prepared a settlement based on a set of assumptions about who held what authority in relation to Mercer Home that turned out to be incorrect. This was not his fault. He had been working from the information his client had provided him, and his client had been operating under the same misunderstanding about his own position that everyone else had been operating under. Because my father-in-law had never told anyone what he had done, we did not respond to the settlement offer. We scheduled the mediation. We prepared the folder. The red tab was my attorney's idea. A small thing. He said it was simply good organizational practice to color code files for quick reference during proceedings. I have always suspected it was also slightly theatrical, that he understood on some level the value of having a visible object in the room whose purpose was unclear until the moment it became very clear. My attorney was methodical. He was also, when the situation called for it, precise about the way a room felt. We arrived at the conference room on a Thursday morning in late November. The sky over Elliott Bay was white and flat. The city was doing what Seattle does in late autumn, presenting itself without drama, without color, without the kind of atmospheric event that would have made the day feel significant. It looked like any other Thursday. It was not any other Thursday. My stepsister was already there when we walked in. She was dressed as if attending an acquisition announcement. A fitted slate gray blazer, diamond studs, dark trousers with a crease you could have measured with a ruler. Her hair was different from how she usually wore it, pulled back more severely, more structured. She looked, in other words, like someone who had spent considerable time preparing for this day. She had no legal standing in that room. She was not a party to the divorce proceedings. She had no attorney at the table representing her interests because she had no interests that required legal representation in this particular venue. She was there because she had decided to be there and because he had allowed it, and because this was her performance, the final scene of a story she had been writing in her head for some time, and she intended to be present for it. His attorney was already seated beside him when we entered. He was a polished man in his mid-50s with the confident posture of an attorney who has handled enough high-asset divorces to know, usually, how they end. He had reviewed the marital estate as his team had disclosed it, and had prepared a settlement offer that was, within the assumptions it operated under, professionally competent. He nodded to my attorney with the brief cordiality of opposing counsel who are conducting a business transaction that neither of them finds personally significant. The preliminary documents were exchanged. His attorney made his opening statement, something measured and practiced about proportionate distribution of marital assets, about acknowledging his central and ongoing role in the growth and management of Mercer Home, about the need for a clean and efficient resolution that served both parties' interests. He was smooth. He was confident. He spoke with the quiet authority of someone who has already decided where the day is going to end up and is simply navigating the procedural requirements to get there. My attorney let him finish every sentence, did not interject, did not shift in his chair. He sat with the red folder in front of him on the table and listened to his attorney's opening with the patient, courteous attention of a man who knows that the other person in the room is operating with incomplete information and has decided for now to let them continue. When his attorney finished, there was a brief pause. Then my stepsister reached into her handbag. I don't know what she was thinking in the moment she reached into that bag. Maybe the silence felt too neutral to her. Maybe the room, without some definitive act, would end without the particular punctuation she had been planning. Maybe she simply could not leave a space, any space, without leaving a mark on it. Maybe the gesture had been planned from the beginning, something she had rehearsed in the mirror of whatever hotel room or apartment she was occupying. Now that she had made herself the central figure in what used to be my life, she withdrew a single bill, freshly printed, crisp in the particular way of money that has not been handled, that has come directly from wherever newly minted money comes from, and has not yet passed through enough human hands to lose its factory edges. She held it between two fingers. She slid it across the walnut surface of the conference table with a motion that was precise and deliberate and too controlled to be anything other than rehearsed. The bill traveled the length of the table and came to rest directly in front of my legal pad, which was sitting in front of me, on which I had written nothing so far because he had told me to let him do the talking. She looked at me. She had the smile she always wore when she was very pleased with herself, warm enough on the surface that you would have to have been watching her for years to recognize it as something else entirely. "Take this $100, she said. "Book yourself a cab back to your parents' house. We are done here. Goodbye." Nobody moved. His attorney's face did something involuntary at the left corner of his eye. A very small, very fast flinch, the kind of thing a professional tries to suppress and doesn't quite manage. His jaw tightened, not with guilt, with the specific tension of a man who had not approved this particular addition to the script and did not like surprises in rooms where things were being decided. And then my attorney laughed. It was not the kind of sound you plan for in a conference room. It was not polite, not restrained, not the throat-clearing near laugh of someone maintaining professional decorum. It was real. It was sharp and sudden and entirely involuntary. The kind of laugh that escapes before the person producing it has had any opportunity to evaluate whether producing it is a good idea. It rang off the glass walls and filled the room with something that none of the careful preparation on the other side of the table had anticipated. He sat upright so fast his chair scraped the floor. "What," he said, "is funny to you right now?" My attorney removed his glasses, took a slow breath, replaced his glasses. Then he picked up the red folder from the table in front of him, placed it precisely in the center of the conference table, and rotated it until the embossed heading faced his side of the room. "I apologize," he said. His voice was very quiet, very clear. The voice of someone who has decided that the fewer words he uses, the more each one will weigh. "I was not prepared for that statement to be entered into the official record. It changes the posture of this conversation significantly. And in my client's favor." Her voice sharpened. "Explain yourself." My attorney looked at her for a long, unhurried moment. Then he looked at his attorney. "I'm laughing," he said, "because you and your client appear to be operating under the sincere belief that my ex-husband holds controlling executive authority over Mercer Home." He tapped the cover of the folder once with one finger. "He does not." The silence that settled after those 3 words was a different kind of silence than the one that had preceded it. Before, the silence had been pressurized, the held breath quiet of people waiting for a specific outcome they had already decided was inevitable. It had the particular texture of rooms in which one side believes the conclusion is foregone and is simply waiting for the other side to arrive at it. This silence was hollow. Like the structural support had been removed from one side of the room, and everything was in the process of determining whether it would hold. His attorney leaned forward. "That's a significant claim. I'd like to review whatever documentation." "You're holding it," my attorney said. He began removing pages from the folder and sliding them across the table, one at a time, with the calm deliberation of someone who has rehearsed this moment not for drama, but for precision. Each page landed cleanly. Each page represented a piece of the structure. My father-in-law, my attorney explained, had restructured the company's ownership into a family operating trust 3 years before the divorce filing. The trust held 56% of all voting shares, the controlling interest. Under the trust's terms, every major financial decision, every acquisition, every structural change above a threshold value required trustee approval. The trustee was not my ex-husband. The trustee was me. His attorney was reading fast, with the focused, rapid energy of an attorney who has just understood that the premise his entire case was built on needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. His expression was not panic. Professionals of his caliber don't panic visibly. It was the controlled version of panic, which is in some ways more uncomfortable to watch precisely because of how hard it works to contain itself. He had gone completely still. Not the restless stillness of a man waiting for his moment. The rigid, airless stillness of a man absorbing information that is reorganizing everything he thought he understood about his own life. She looked at he. She looked at the documents. She looked at he again. For the first time in all the years I had known her, through childhood and adolescence and adulthood and every family gathering and every small familiar act of reaching toward what someone else had, she had nothing to say. No line prepared, no expression deployed. The performance, so carefully assembled over so many years, had simply stopped. My attorney continued. "There is a second matter," he said. "My client entered into a formal consulting agreement with Mercer Home prior to commencing the substantive operational work she performed for the company. The scope of that agreement covered distribution infrastructure restructuring, vendor contract renegotiation, and related strategic consulting. The documented outcomes include a distribution model redesign that reduced logistics costs by an estimated $8.7 million over 3 years, and a supplier agreement restructuring that corrected a 6% quarterly margin loss that had gone unaddressed for over a decade." He looked at his attorney directly. "The compensation owed under that agreement is a contractual obligation of the company. It is separate from and independent of any marital asset calculation. It is not included in the settlement proposal your client has put forward." A brief pause. "The settlement proposal your client has put forward does not begin to reflect my client's actual legal and financial position." His attorney asked for a recess. His voice was professionally steady. His hands, gathering the pages he had slid across the table, were not quite. My attorney gave him 20 minutes. During those 20 minutes, she sat with her hands folded on the table, looking at a fixed point somewhere past the window, at the white flat sky above Elliott Bay. He spoke to his attorney in a low voice in the corner of the room. His attorney's responses were brief and increasingly terse. The $100 bill was still on the table, sitting in front of my legal pad exactly where it had landed when she slid it there. Nobody touched it. "I won't walk you through every line of the final settlement. Some of it remains confidential by mutual agreement, and that is fine with me. What I will tell you is what mattered." The recess lasted 38 minutes. When his attorney came back to the table, his posture was different. Not collapsed, not defeated, but recalibrated in the specific way of a professional who has been handed new information and is in the process of rebuilding his position around it. He asked several questions about the trust structure. My attorney answered them precisely and without elaboration. His attorney asked about the consulting agreement. My attorney provided the documentation. His attorney requested an additional 48 hours to review. My attorney gave him 72. The settlement that was ultimately reached reflected, for the first time, what the assets actually were and who actually held authority over them. He retained his title at Mercer Home and his minority equity stake. He kept the apartment and the car and the the watch collection and all the visible surface markers of a life he had built around an image of himself. What he lost was the substance beneath the image, the authority he had been representing himself as holding, the story he had been telling about who he was in relation to the company his grandfather had built. The consulting agreement was honored. The trust structure was acknowledged and formalized in the settlement record. I walked away with a financial outcome that accurately reflected 4 years of real, documented, consequential work. She left the building before the final signatures were exchanged. I didn't watch her go. I heard the door. I heard later, through someone we both knew from years before, that she and he ended within 5 months. No announcement, no visible falling out. It simply stopped. The way things built on a false foundation eventually stopped, quietly, without ceremony, because the thing that had held it together was never real to begin with. My father-in-law called me 2 weeks after the settlement. He didn't say much. He asked how I was. He said he was glad he had been thorough. There was a long pause, and then he said, in the unhurried way that was characteristic of everything he did, "You always saw it more clearly than anyone. I just made sure the paperwork said so." I stayed on as trustee for 14 more months. My father-in-law and I worked well together. We always had. At a natural transition point, I stepped back by choice, left the trust in clean and well-documented condition, and walked out of Mercer Home for the last time on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, when the cherry trees along the waterfront were beginning to open. I live on the east side of Seattle now, a smaller place, a good kitchen, a desk by a window where the light comes in right in the mornings. I consult independently. Companies that need someone who can read between the lines of a balance sheet, find the assumptions nobody has questioned in years, identify what's actually happening underneath the story a company tells about itself. I am good at it. I have always been good at seeing what is actually there. Here is what I want to leave you with. My stepsister slid that $100 across the table because she had already decided what I was: defeated, replaceable, a chapter that was closing. She had written the ending before she walked into the room, and she wanted me to confirm it. What she never considered, what people like her almost never consider, is the work that happened before the room. The years of quiet, documented, precise work that nobody photographed or announced or celebrated, the agreements filed away in drawers, the restructuring that saved millions that was never attached to anyone's name. The consulting agreement signed almost as a formality, almost as a piece of paper in a drawer, that turned out to be the document the whole day rotated on. She saw the surface of a life and thought she understood the whole of it. She was wrong. And the moment my attorney laughed, that sharp, genuine, involuntary laugh that rang off the glass walls of that conference room and filled the room with something nobody had planned for, that was the moment the room found out. The $100 bill sat on the table the whole time. Nobody touched it.